Hey everyone, welcome back to the Whole Bible series. Today we're going to be surveying Genesis 12 through 23. So just a quick rehash, what is Genesis? Genesis comes from the first word of the Bible in the book of, or it should be in the Hebrew translation, which gets translated into uh, Greek and then into English as Genesis. Again, it's the first book of the Bible. If you guys missed out, please jump back to episode 2. Who wrote Genesis and when? Moses is known to have written Genesis through both Hebrew and Christian tradition. So I will continue to refer to him as the writer. Please see episode 2 if you want more information there. So last week we had a summary of Genesis 1 through 11. So let's go through that real quick. So this is really creation in 3 rebellions. So the first rebellion was the rebellion by man in the Garden of Eden. The second rebellion was the rebellion of the sons of God. So divine rebellion. And then the third rebellion was the Tower of Babel, which was actually both human and divine rebellion. If you want more information on those, please go back and watch episode 3. So now we're going to start surveying the rest of the book of Genesis. While the rest of the book of Genesis is broken down here in chapters 12 through 50, this week we'll only be doing the story of Abraham, which is chapters 12 through 23. So let's kind of set this up. So after Babel in Genesis 11, we have what is called the Table of Nations. So again, referring to Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. So God kept his promise to Noah that he wouldn't destroy all living life, or excuse me, all life on the earth again, and rather scatters people from Babel and disinherits them. So none of these people belong to him anymore. He has disinherited these nations. And so that's where we're left off in chapter 11. From there in chapter 11, we get a rundown of Shem's descendants. So Shem is a son of Noah, which we see here on the left in the Table of Nations. There were 3 sons of Noah. So through Shem comes Abram, which we're going to talk about tonight, through Arpachshad, which ends up here near this yellow star. This is where they kind of settle. And by the time we get to Terah, who is Abram's father, they have migrated south here, closer to Babylon, and a city called Ur. So let's go ahead. I'm going to read chapter 11, verse 27 through 32. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren; she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So we can see that Terah takes Abram and Sarai and Lot, and they travel along the Fertile Crescent here, aiming to travel to Canaan, but they actually stop and settle here near Haran, where this blue star is. And that brings us to chapter 12. So we've talked about the nations being disinherited, and so God has no nation to himself, and so he decides to start a new nation. So he pulls from Mesopotamia a man called Abram. And this is the story of that. Verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. So we see here God calls Abram from his people and sets him aside. He is now set aside as the beginning of a new nation. God is starting something new, but his purpose is clear here in verse 3, that through Abraham all families of the earth shall be blessed. So while all the nations have been disinherited, God has a plan to provide blessing to them and bring them back to him at some point. And Abram is the start of that. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. I want to give you a little background on Canaan itself, as our story is bringing us into the land of Canaan. So Canaan was a son of Ham, who was a son of Noah. So Canaan's actually the grandson of Noah. So we're going to skip back to Genesis 9, which we didn't really get into detail in our last survey, but this is important here. So it says, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his youngest son Ham had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And so I'm not going to get too deep into this story. We could have a full episode on this story. But because of Ham's sin against Noah, Noah has cursed Canaan. And so we find that Canaan, and therefore the land of Canaan, his offspring, are cursed and are called to be servants of the other nations, of his brothers. I want to look also here to Numbers 13 here on the left. This comes from a time where Moses had sent spies out into the land of Canaan to look at what's going on there. And they come back and report to Moses. And this is part of that report. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it of our great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So not only is Canaan cursed, but now it's full of these Anakim. And as we talked about last time, who the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. So the Nephilim are part divine, and these are known to be giants. And so the Anakim come from the Nephilim. This is the next generation of Nephilim. And so these giants rule the land. So not only is Canaan cursed, but it's full of these giants walking around. And so the Israelites are scared. So that gives us a background of Canaan that Abram is walking into with his wife and his nephew Lot. We'll continue in chapter 12, verse 5. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to a place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. All right, so I want to note here, you're going to see a lot of things as we go through here especially in Genesis, but through the whole Bible. And you're going to start seeing things that pop out. One of these things are notations of trees or oaks, wells, gardens, mountains, these kind of things. These are very important to the ancient peoples. And so in the desert, in the wilderness, trees and wells are known as areas of life. This is areas where water exists in a land where there's very little water. And so these are known as areas that bring life. And because they bring life, they're known meeting spots for divine meetings. We also know that the gardens and mountains are known to be dwelling places of gods. Gardens, like an oasis, are lush and full of life. And so they're known to be dwelling places of gods. Mountains, they're tops of the mountains dwell in the heavens. And so the ancient peoples believed that the gods or God lived on mountains. The firmament, the dome of the earth, they believed rested on the top of mountains. And so it was they were obvious places for gods to hang out and to live. And so if someone was to climb a mountain, they would become closer to God or to the gods because of the proximity to the heavens. So the oak here of Moreh keys us into an idea that we're going to see played out here in chapter 12. I'll read it again. So when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land at the place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At the time, there were Canaanites in the land. Then the Lord appeared. So the Lord appears here at the oaks. Like I said, a common meeting place for divine encounters. So the Lord appears to Abram and says, your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Excuse me. So I want to see here, this is the first time in the Bible where the Lord appears. Okay, so this is anthropomorphic language talking about a physical form of God. All right, and so there is many mentions in the Old Testament of the physical appearance of Yahweh. Sometimes it's described in anthropomorphic language of Yahweh, and in other times it refers to him as the angel of the Lord or the angel of God. In early Hebrew thought, this character was known as the second Yahweh figure, right? Not a second God, but the second Yahweh figure. And part of the reason for that is because they believed that you couldn't look upon Yahweh's face, that you would die if you encountered the glory of Yahweh's face. And so this must be a second Yahweh figure, a physical presence that can be seen and felt and touched. And so it makes a lot of sense for us now, looking back from the New Testament, to see this character as the Son of God prior to his incarnation as Jesus. Continuing in chapter 12. From there he moved, speaking of Abram, to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going towards the Negev. So the Negev here in the bottom part of what is now Jerusalem is more of a desert. And so Abram is heading that way. Continuing in chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a beautiful woman in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. Say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, They praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So there's a little foreshadowing here of plagues in Egypt against Pharaoh. Verse 18. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So we see here that while Abram is following God, he hasn't learned to trust God yet. Here he's fearing for his life, and so he gets his wife to lie for him uh, so that he's not killed. But yet, while Abram is not trusting God, God continues to keep his promise. God has promised to make him great and to make a people out of him. And God keeps his promise and blesses Abraham with all sorts of wealth, with animals and servants that are given to him by Pharaoh. Abram is given all this, even though he's a failed, flawed individual. And so they head back to Canaan in chapter 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. So as we talked about, he's being blessed by God. Even though he doesn't deserve it, he's being blessed. And he journeyed from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. So at this point, Abram has no children. It said that Sarah was barren, that she couldn't have any children. And so Lot is Abraham's obvious heir, that if God is going to bless Abraham with a great nation, I guess it's going to have to be through Lot. But here, as they settle near Bethel and Ai, Lot and Abram, their herdsmen, they both have great herds, and their herdsmen begin fighting. So Lot and Abram agree to separate. Abram gives Lot a choice. Do you want to go to the left or the right? Take your choice pick of the land. And Lot chooses to head down into the Jordan Valley and ends up settling here near this yellow star near Sodom. And so the rest of the land is where Abram has to choose to begin. Where is this nation going to begin? And so Abram now has to settle. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look to the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that no one can count the dust of the earth. Your offspring also cannot be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are near Hebron, and there built an altar for the Lord. So I highlighted here oaks, just so you notice it. But you're going to continue to notice this as we go throughout the Old Testament. You're going to notice things like this. Chapter 14. So chapter 14 is an odd encounter. It kind of feels a little out of place in the narrative. What happens is that these kings from Mesopotamia come down and attack and capture the cities of Sodom and Zoar and Tamar and Kadesh. And so they attack these places and carry off things and people. And so part of their treasure that they carry off is Lot. Lot gets carried off. And so these kings come down and attack and pillage, and they carry off the things that they stole and Lot, and take them back near Damascus, back to the area of the Mesopotamian kings. And so Abram finds out about this, and he brings his men together, and they mount a rescue. And so Abram and his men go up near Damascus and in the area which is later known as Dan, and they attack these Mesopotamian kings, and they win with God's favor. They take back the all the ransom, all the loot that these kings have stolen. They take it all back and bring back Lot with them. And so they're traveling back to their territories. And we find something odd that happens. So Abram comes into contact with a character called Melchizedek. Melchizedek is interesting. You see the scripture here on the left, which we'll talk about in just a second. But Melchizedek is the king of Salem. But it's interesting is he's not only a king, but he's a priest. So let's read what it says. So this is chapter 14, verse 17. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. So not only is he a king of Salem, later known as Jerusalem, the city of peace, but he's also a priest of Yahweh God. So it's been clear in the passage so far that Abram was called out by God, and that Abram was building a people of God, that all the other nations have been disinherited. And yet this Melchizedek character is a priest of Yahweh God. So it's obvious that he is a free agent, that he doesn't lead a nation of God, but that he believes in Yahweh God and has been somehow called a priest. And so this character, Melchizedek, verse 19, blesses Abram and says, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And then something interesting happens. Abram gives him a tenth of everything. So the priest of God Most High blesses Abram, and Abram gives him a tithe. He gives him a tithe of all that he carried off from the Mesopotamian kings. Another interesting thing that happens in chapter 14 is that Abram gives all of the loot back to the original kings who it was stolen from. He doesn't keep anything for himself. He asks that his people be taken care of, but he doesn't keep anything for himself. And so scholars think that this points to the fact that the original writer, in our case, we believe Moses, wants people to know that none of Abram's wealth comes from Canaan or from these kings, but from God alone. Moving on to chapter 15. We now begin to see God's covenant with Abram taking shape. And a covenant during this time period has many elements. So you see here on the left, the elements of the covenant. Number one, there must be between two or more people. Number two, a ceremony is conducted to seal that covenant. Number three, there must be a physical sign. Number four, it involves a witness or witnesses. And number five, it spells out consequences for those who break it. So we should see the beginning of the covenant here taking shape in chapter 15. Verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars and see if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. So now God promises him a son. So his nation, this big nation that God will be building through Abram, is not going to come through Lot, but from a son from his own loins. And then important, verse 6 here, it says, And he, speaking of Abram, believed the Lord, and it counted to him as righteousness. So we've seen in the first two episodes how sinful and unrighteous both Noah and Abram are, and yet God counts his belief as righteousness. And so this believing loyalty to Yahweh is going to become a very big part of the story of the Bible itself. People aren't righteous on their own. They can never be good enough. But the fact that they have this believing loyalty to Yahweh, and regardless of what happens and what they do, they trust in Yahweh as their only way to salvation. This becomes a major theme of the Bible. Continuing on, verse 7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans and give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all of these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against each other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So this is interesting. This is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to the nation that comes from Abram. This nation is said that they will be sent as sojourners to another land, and where they'll serve for 400 years. But that when God does rescue them and brings them back, they'll come out with great possessions. And then we get an idea of one of the reasons why God is not allowing them to take possession of the entire land now. It says, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And so the Amorites are a people that live in the area we know as Syria now, which is up in this upper part of the map. And so God is making it clear that when they do come back, they're going to come back to punish the Amorites. But he says that the Amorites' sin has not yet been complete. So God is waiting patiently to punish them. Verse 17, back to the covenant. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces, talking of the animals, the sacrificed animals. And so now we see the ceremony part of the covenant. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so God promises to Abram the land that we see here in the map, or more or less. And so on the left side near Sinai, we see this is what he's referring to when he talks of the river of Egypt. And then up here, the Euphrates River. So these are the boundaries. And so this whole general area is the promised land. This is the area that God is promising to Abram. That brings us to chapter 16. Verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. So we've already talked about Sarai being barren, being childless. And in the ancient times, barrenness was known to the people as being a curse or being in God or the God's disfavor. Whereas fertility is a blessing from God. And so to this point, Sarai has been in their mind cursed, that she is not in God's favor because he hasn't opened her womb to give her children. So keep that in mind as we go. And so Sarai at this time starts coming up with a plan. We're going to see here, continuing on. I'll read again in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, that it may be that I obtain children by her. So this is a common practice in the ancient Near East, where if a woman was unable to conceive children, she may give one of her servants as a surrogate, and that way the father may continue his line through the surrogate. Continuing on. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord, going back to our talk earlier about the second Yahweh figure, this Yahweh figure that's tangible, that she can see, that is there in physical form. The angel of the Lord found her by, again, a spring of water in the wilderness. All right, so now we have a divine encounter near a well again. The spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So I see here on the left, we have a little quote from Genesis 25, which is we'll cover next week. But it talks about the generations of Ishmael. And so we see here at the bottom, it says that he settled over against all his kinsmen, which is paralleling what it says here in verse 12, that he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Basically, what that means is he is going to be living opposite his kinsmen and will be against them. So we'll continue more with Ishmael's story here in a bit. Verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Chapter 17. Now we're getting back to the covenant. The covenant was started earlier in chapter 15. We're getting back to the completion of the covenant. Verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, and so this is 13 years after Ishmael is born. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly." Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to be your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." So we talked earlier about there needing to be a physical sign of a covenant. This is it, circumcision. Verse 12, "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. An uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant." Continuing verse 15. And God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed to himself. "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael may live before you." So here Abraham is pleading for Ishmael, his son, to be his heir. God has promised now to give the nations through this new son that Sarah's going to bear. But Abraham loves Ishmael and wants Ishmael to be his heir. And God responds in verse 19. God said, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." So we see here a note that's saying that God's saying that he's going to make Ishmael into a great nation, but that Ishmael will father 12 princes. We'll look here in verse 25, or excuse me, in chapter 25. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes, according to their tribes. Then continue on in chapter 17, Abraham fulfills this covenant by circumcising all the men in his camp, including himself. So Abraham completes the covenant with God. Chapters 18 and 19 are a quick overview of Sodom and Gomorrah, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you don't know it, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed due to complete corruption. This is what God promises to do later to the Amorites once their sin is complete. Well, obviously in this story, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah are complete. And so God destroys them with raining fire and sulfur from heaven. But God saves Lot and his daughters. During the flee from Sodom, Lot's wife dies because she disobeys God. But Lot and his daughters are saved by God. Later in the story, you find that there's nations that come from Lot through his daughters. So there's an odd story there, which you can read on your own. But the nations of Moab and Ammon come from the loin of Lot. So Moab and Ammon here circled on the map. So they're to the east of the Dead Sea, not too far from where Sodom and Gomorrah were. Moab and Ammon become nations, and they're given land by God outside of the territory of Israel later on. And these two nations exist throughout the Old Testament, and they're really frenemies of Israel. At times they're helpful, and at other times they're adversaries. Chapter 20. So in chapter 20, we get another story about Abraham failing again. So he moves back to the Negev, and out of fear, once again, he tells a king that Sarah is his sister. And in doing so, the king adds Sarah as a wife, but is warned before he touches her that she's already married. God threatens to kill the king unless he gets Abraham to pray for him. And so the king comes back to Abraham and begs for his life and gives him all sorts of riches and possessions, asking Abraham to pray for him. And Abraham does. Abraham prays for him, and the king is saved, but he sends Abraham away with his wife. And once again, while Abraham's not learned to trust God fully, God continues to bless Abraham, even though he doesn't deserve it. Chapter 21. This is the promise of, or the promised child comes. So let's look at verse 1. So the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said that to Abraham and Sarah, or that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And so now, as we talked about barrenness before, Sarah has been blessed by God. And so the opening of her womb is seen as a blessing. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. So now Sarah sees uh, Ishmael as a competitor, as a threat to the promise of Isaac. God has promised to build a great nation through Isaac, and Sarah sees Ishmael as a threat. So she tells Abraham to do away with him. Verse 11, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall be your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So God promises to bless Ishmael because he comes from Abraham. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and the skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water of the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went away and sat down opposite of him a good way off, about a distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat there opposite of him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold fast him with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So we see here circled on the map is the wilderness of Paran. This is the area where Ishmael grows up and where his nation begins. Just some notes here on the left. Here's a note from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. It says, ultimately, the biblical narratives communicate that although Ishmael was not part of the Abrahamic covenant, God does not forget him. The divine pronouncement in his birth narrative demonstrates Ishmael is a person of value and important to the narrative. So Ishmael, being made into a great nation, is important to God's story. And while that may not be very, very clear throughout parts of the Bible, we can see how that plays out a little bit today. So down here is a note from Jason Cristiano Ramon. Ishmael is mentioned several times throughout the Quran, and it is through the Islamic Holy Scripture that he is invoked as a messenger, prophet, and one preferred by God. The Quran upholds the Muslim belief that Ishmael was Abraham's ultimate heir, not Isaac. So most Muslims, or I shouldn't say most, many Muslims will trace their nation, the nation of Islam, back to Ishmael. And so if that's true, if the Islamic nation goes back to Ishmael, then God has indeed made Ishmael into a great nation, one that is over against his brother Israel, or I should say his brother Isaac, who is where Israel comes from. And so that would go a long way in explaining a lot of what we see today. We can talk about this more during question and answer time. Feel free to post questions below. Chapter 22. Verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took his hand, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father," he said. "Here I am, my son," he said. "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, saying, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you as an offspring, or multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand of the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Again, we see the angel of the Lord showing up, the second Yahweh figure, and we can equate it here. He says, "By myself I have sworn, and surely I will multiply you." And so this equates the angel of the Lord to Yahweh God. And so we see here that Abraham's faith is finally made complete. He trusts God to the point that he was willing to sacrifice his only son, his heir, the one that God had promised to build the nation through. This is reflected on in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And so Abraham's faith in Yahweh God is now complete. He's no longer lying, but he's trusting God even with the life of his son. In chapter 23, we see Sarah dies. Sarah dies at 127 years old. At this point, Isaac's 37. And Abraham goes and acquires a field and a cave near Hebron to bury Sarah. And so this is the beginning of a nation. God has started a new nation after abandoning all others. He's now planning to bless this new nation with land and with a room to grow into a great nation. And it starts here with Abraham's purchase of a field in Hebron. But how will that little purchase of land grow into the entire promised land we see here on the map on the right? And so that's it for today. I hope you join us next week to find out more of how that happens. If you have questions, again, comment below, and I look forward to talking to you. God bless.